Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahid Jurjan. We're going to examine a trio of Psalms in our study today as we focus on the God of Deliverance. This is about Psalms 59, 60, and 61. Deliverance is, in fact, one of the key terms that's used throughout the Psalter. Sometimes deliverance appears in the form of rescue from enemies. Sometimes it's deliverance from the pain and suffering caused by one's own sinful deeds. Deliverance can either be focused on an individual or a corporate group of people. And when the psalmists cry out to the God of deliverance, they do so because they know his character and they have confidence in his power. They believe in God's unfailing love for his people and that will spurn him into action. And they believe that as the Creator and God Almighty, Yahweh is most capable of enacting any kind of deliverance that the psalmist might require. Deliverance is the central call of Psalms 59 and 60. Psalm 59 is a powerful, personal prayer offered by David when Saul had sent men to watch David's house in order to kill him. The threat of violence and danger to his life prompted David to cry out to God for rescue. Psalm 60 is also a prayer for deliverance, also offered by David, but it's not just something he prayed for his own sake. He represented a group of people who in this case felt as though God had rejected them, and so David comes to pray on their behalf. And then the capstone of this little trilogy is Psalm 61. Now, it's also a prayer, but it's not really one that's offered for rescue. It's more like a psalm of trust, where David declares his confidence in God's protection and his desire to dwell with God forever. And so we see deliverance running throughout the veins of these three psalms, connecting them together. Let's start with Psalm 51, which we might title, "Deliver Me from My Enemies." Now again, the superscript of this psalm gives us a historical backdrop, when Saul had sent men to watch David's house in order to kill him. And this harkens way back to a scene that's recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 19, when King Saul began his campaign against David. You might remember that Saul had tried to skewer David with a spear, and when the young man fled, Saul sent men to pursue and kill the son of Jesse. It was the help of Saul's daughter, which was also David's wife, Michal, that allowed him to escape on that particular occasion. Let's begin now by reading from verse 1. "Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Be my fortress against those who are attacking me. Deliver me from evildoers and save me from those who are after my blood." You can see here David's prayer begins very plaintively, and it appeals to God's rescuing power. Going on now, beginning in verse 3. "See how they lie in wait for me. Fierce men conspire against me for no offense or sin of mine, Yahweh. I have done no wrong, yet they are ready to attack me. Arise to help me. Look on my plight. You, Yahweh God Almighty, you who are the God of Israel, rouse yourself to punish all the nations. Show no mercy to wicked traitors." David pleads his innocence here and calls upon God to arise and act. Now notice in verse 5, he likens the wicked traitors to the nations. And this might suggest that maybe in David's mind, those who have betrayed him, even if they are Israelites, are no better than the Gentiles, because the traitors and the Gentiles alike are all opposed to the will of God. Moving on now, beginning in verse 6. "They return at evening, snarling like dogs, and prowl about the city. See what they spew from their mouths. The words from their lips are sharp as swords. And they think, who can hear us? But you laugh at them, Yahweh. You scoff at all those nations. You are my strength, I watch for you. You, God, are my fortress, my God on whom I can rely." Now, some of the language in this section aligns with Psalm 2. You might remember that in Psalm 2, the nations are plotting. They're secretly conspiring together to overthrow Yahweh and his anointed king. And when God hears about their conspiracy, it says in Psalm 2, verse 4, that he laughs and he scoffs. The imagery of God as a fortress is also common in many of David's prayers. It's more intense here by contrasting God as this stronghold against the fact that David's enemies are like prowling dogs. And so we might envision them stalking about the fortress, looking for an open passage so they can get inside and devour their prey. This concept is going to appear again at the end of the psalm, as does the refrain, "You are my strength. I watch for you, God. You are my fortress, my God on whom I can rely." That's going to be repeated again at the end. Verse 11, "God will go before me and will let me gloat over those who slander me. But do not kill them, Lord our shield, or my people will forget. In your might uproot them and bring them down, for the sins of their mouths, for the words of their lips. Let them be caught in their pride, for the curses and lies they utter. Consume them in your wrath. Consume them till they are no more. Then it will be known to the ends of the earth that God rules over Jacob." Now, this is an interesting twist here in the typical lament plea. Usually God just wants David to kill his enemies. In the previous psalm, in fact, which was quite graphic, he asked that God would make the wicked like the slug that melts away as it moves along, or like a stillborn child that never sees the sun. So he wants the wicked basically just to disappear as if they never even existed. In this case, however, David seems to want his enemies to be exposed rather than to be killed. Perhaps he wants them to stand trial as traitors against the kingdom so that, he believes, all will see God's justice and all will know that God is king over Israel. Moving on now, verse 14. "They return at evening, snarling like dogs, and prowl about the city." Here's the return of that imagery. "They wander about for food and howl if not satisfied. But I will sing of your strength. In the morning I will sing of your love, for you are my fortress, my refuge in times of trouble. You are my strength. I sing praise to you. You, God, are my fortress, my God on whom I can rely." Now, throughout the night, the traitors will bark and prowl. The imagery here is quite vivid. We can just imagine David being holed up in some location, knowing that the enemies are right outside seeking to consume him. But in spite of their barking and howling, David doesn't really seem bothered. Inside the fortress of God's protection, he is sleeping soundly. And then the morning comes, and morning is always a positive thing in the Psalter. And in the morning, he awakens to sing a song dedicated to the Lord. In spite of the intensity of his enemies, David's confidence in God and praise for his strength is high. And that is how Psalm 59 concludes, with another song about God's strength, God's protection, God, David's fortress. And now we move from Psalm 59 into Psalm 60. For Psalm 60, we might give the title, "Do Not Forsake Us." Now, there is another historical note in the superscript of this psalm, and it seems to connect this psalm with a series of military battles that are documented in 2 Samuel chapter 8. Now, if that connection is accurate, then this incident, and this psalm, is set several years after Psalm 59. In Psalm 59, David is starting his flight from Saul, but now David is king. In fact, he's won the civil war, which followed the death of Saul. He's at the height of his power. However, according to this psalm, something has gone wrong. This sounds a lot like Psalm 44, which is a lament that was likely written as a result of a military defeat. So in Psalm 60, David and his army have become convinced that a recent loss in a battle is a direct result of God abandoning them. And when they realize this is the case, they come to God to pray. So the superscript says, "For the director of music, to the tune of the Lily of the Covenant, a miktam of David for teaching, when he fought Aram Naharaim and Aram Zobah, and when Joab returned and struck down 12,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt." All right, let's begin in verse 1 of Psalm 60. You have rejected us, God, and burst upon us. You have been angry, now restore us. You have shaken the land and torn it open. Mend its fractures, for it is quaking. You have shown your people desperate times. You have given us wine that makes us stagger. But for those of us who fear you, you have raised a banner to be unfurled against the bow. God's rejection of Israel has resulted in the promised land being torn apart and the army becoming like a band of drunks. Now, this language could all be poetic. It's just serving David's point here, which is that everything we try fails. And it's certain to us now that God is the cause. God is against us. Verse 5, save us and help us with your right hand, that those you love may be delivered. God has spoken from his sanctuary in triumph. I will parcel out Shechem and measure off the valley of Succoth. Gilead is mine, and Manasseh is mine. Ephraim is my helmet. Judah is my scepter. Moab is my wash basin. On Edom I toss my sandal. Over Philistia I shout in triumph. Having laid out the crisis, David pleads with God on the basis of his love for Israel. Now, what evidence is there to suggest that God loves Israel? Well, of course, the very fact of their inheritance in the promised land. I mean, not only is this land Israel's inheritance, it's also God's possession. He is the one who triumphantly divided it. Special attention here is given to Ephraim and Judah as the helmet and the scepter. Ephraim was the largest and most prosperous of the northern tribes, and of course, Judah dominated the south. Ephraim is like the headgear that the warrior wears for protection, and Judah is like the commander's staff that the warrior wields. And then some of Israel's neighbors are even mentioned, including Moab, Edom, and Philistia. Now, this corresponds again to 2 Samuel 8. These three tribes are all said to have been defeated by David, and then they were even made subject to Israel's authority, and that, of course, means they're under God's rule. But now, let's move on to verse 9, where something has gone wrong. Who will bring me to the fortified city? Who will lead me to Edom? Is it not you, God? You who have now rejected us and no longer go out with our armies. Give us aid against the enemy, for human help is worthless. With God, we will gain the victory, and he will trample down our enemies. Now, here we have some difficulty. Difficulty particularly in harmonizing this psalm with what we read in 2 Samuel chapter 8. In 2 Samuel 8, David seems to win every battle. He's on kind of a military hot streak. In fact, the war ends with Edom, and we'll notice that there's an emphasis here in Psalm 60 on Edom, but this is what the record in 2 Samuel 8 verses 13 and 14 says. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. Yahweh gave David victory wherever he went. And so whatever defeat is being referenced in Psalm 60, it's not recorded in 2 Samuel. Now, it's possible that this defeat occurred perhaps just before this final push against Edom after the Moabites, Ammonites, Amalekites, and Philistines were all subdued. So you can imagine these successful campaigns against all these tribes, and Edom is the last stop of this war. And somewhere along the way, there's a defeat, a setback. And in result or in response to that setback, David now turns to God. And Yahweh's reply comes in the form of this final push, this resounding victory against Edom. Now, we've looked at two Psalms. In Psalm 59, we see a young David. He's running for his life. He's asking God to deliver him from his enemies. In Psalm 60, an older King David has suffered a defeat. He's seeking a restoration of the relationship between God and the people so that the Lord can intervene and aid them in their military campaign. Now, Psalm 61 is different. It's not a lament seeking some resolution to a specific problem, although the idea is alluded in the psalm. Really, this is a prayer of trust. And it's a very fitting capstone that kind of rounds out this little trilogy of prayers. We could give the title, God's Presence is My Refuge. Now, unlike Psalms 59 and 60, there's no historical note in Psalm 61 in the superscript. But it seems likely that this prayer is written maybe before David finally becomes king, because one of the things he prays for is for a blessing upon the king, and he makes it sound like he's asking that blessing for someone else. All the superscript says is for the director of music with stringed instruments of David. Psalm 61, beginning now in verse 1. Hear my cry, O God. Listen to my prayer. From the ends of the earth I call to you. I call as my heart grows faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe. I long to dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. For you, God, have heard my vows. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. David offered this prayer, it seems, while in some distant land. He makes reference to the ends of the earth. Now, this could be literal, like David is off in some far country, or maybe it's used figuratively here, just to speak of how he feels in his heart. Maybe this was written after he fled the tabernacle, when he was on the run from Saul, and now that distance from God's holy place makes him feel separated from the presence of God. Each of the images he uses here, rock, refuge, tent, and shelter of your wings, are elsewhere used as metaphors that represent God's temple or God's dwelling place. And so David is moving here. He's asking to come from this distant land where his prayer is being offered closer into the very center of God's dwelling place on the earth. If David is, in fact, on the run from Saul in this psalm, then I think these next words are quite potent. Verses 6 through 8. Increase the days of the king's life, his years for many generations. May he be enthroned in God's presence forever. Appoint your love and faithfulness to protect him. Then I will ever sing in praise of your name and fulfill my vows day after day. I think, of course, there's a potent lesson for Christians to learn from these words. I mean, Saul wanted David dead. The king was actively trying to kill him. Yet David always acknowledged that Saul was Yahweh's anointed. He was chosen by God to lead Israel. And so David prayed for the king to enjoy a long life and for his seat of power to be protected by God's presence, the very same presence that he longs to dwell in, according to verse 4. Now, while presidents and other political powers are not ordained by God as King Saul was, I think there's still a profound lesson here that educates us into how we should talk and pray for our leaders. We should know, of course, that name-calling and peddling in conspiracy theories and speaking derogatorily about elected officials, it's not only unhelpful and counterproductive to good civility, it's profoundly dangerous. I mean, the Apostle Peter commanded believers to honor the king in 1 Peter 2:15. And that word honor means to show high regard or even to revere. This, of course, doesn't mean that Christians can't have strong opinions about the events of the day, even very negative opinions, but we need to be careful and make sure that we respect elected officials and pray for them appropriately. Now, after praying for the king, David commits to future acts of worship and to fulfill those vows that he has made to God day after day. David, of course, demonstrates a strong commitment to his relationship with God in this psalm in particular. As Wilson writes, if we would truly desire to find protection under the wings of God, we must bind ourselves to Him in longing and desire and build a relationship of continuing and lasting commitment. As God is a God of loyal love and enduring faithfulness, we must become people shaped by the same characteristics, commitment and love. And so, in Psalm 59, we see a young David. He's running for his life. He's asking God to deliver him from his enemies. In Psalm 60, an older King David has suffered a defeat, and he seeks to restore his people's relationship with God so the Lord can intervene and do what? Deliver them in battle. And then Psalm 61. This psalm really reveals who David was, what he was all about. In his times of struggle and despair, he so frequently turned to God for deliverance because of that relationship, because he saw God as that place of refuge, because he relied on God's love, on God's faithfulness, and so in turn, David showed his own love and faithfulness to God. You know, as we've been working our way through this section of the Psalter, we've noticed that it's really packed with lament prayers from David. And we might wonder why David so frequently prayed the way that he prayed. And I think Psalm 61 gives us the answer. It illuminates the heart of this man who knew that Yahweh is a God of deliverance. I mean, where else would David even think to turn except for the saving, loving, faithful, delivering God that David had come to know and had come to love and follow? And so we see in these Psalms the God of deliverance. Thank you for being here for this examination of Psalms 59, 60, and 61. Come back and be with us next time as we continue our journey through the Psalter. God bless.